Welcome, Professor Sunstein. We are very glad to have you. My first questions are about the writing process. It's some human interest. I always like to have human interest questions when I watch an interview, so that's the reason. So you three authors of Noise, you come from different continents, different disciplines, different mother tongues, I think. But the book seems quite consistent in style, and that must have been difficult to achieve. Compliments, but how did you do it? And did you disagree a lot about the formulations in the book, about how it was framed? Maybe you did rewrite a lot, having a lot of fun or having a lot of trouble among each other. So can you reflect on that?
The book was a great joy to write, but it was also an adventure, which is to say, a challenge. The joy of it was we really like each other, the three of us. Kahneman and I have been friends for a long, long time, and I admire him, and I also like him a great deal. He's a lot of fun as well as wise. The challenge was that we write very differently. So Olivier Sibony is a business school professor, and he writes in a way that is very well suited for that role. Danny Kahneman is a serious writer. He's a very lucid writer. He doesn't make a lot of allowances for newcomers to the topic. I think I, of the three, am the most playful writer. And at times, Danny in particular thought this book isn't for laughter and fun, it's for a serious point, and the playfulness is not particularly welcome. Some of the playfulness did emerge unscathed from the process of the three-author collaboration. We were acutely aware that we have different writing styles, the three, and I'm very pleased if it doesn't show in the book that we write differently. I learned to try to mimic Danny's style to the extent that I could and tried to write in the way that he does. And I think at times he had a little more fun in the writing than he would typically have, and his wit showed up. It was, I'd say, the most challenging and the most entertaining collaboration I've ever had. The combination of we visited hours on end in New York and had fun, and then we'd write a draft, and then Danny typically would say, this is terrible. We have to start over. And that happened maybe 10,000 times.
Nice to hear something about this process. You have written books with co-authors from various disciplines. And as an economist, I'm interested in not hearing from you. Do economists have a different view of the world than philosophers, law professors, psychologists, in your experience?
Definitely. And even though economists differ from one another, there's one thing that they tend to share, in my experience, which is they're really interested in making predictions and in developing testable hypotheses. So when I write with an economist, a question is frequently, what's our hypothesis and how do we know that it's true? I learned this question, by the way, as if it's a song that should be sung every morning when you wake up and every night when you go to sleep. What's your hypothesis, and is it true? From Gary Becker at the University of Chicago, who was my colleague for a long time. And behavioral economists who are very critical of Becker's work on rationality, they agree that that's the question. Philosophers are often interested not at all in prediction. In fact, I think most of the time they're not interested in testable hypotheses. They're interested in giving a thick description of human experience, if the domain of philosophy in which they work entails that. And so if you give an account of, let's say, liberty, that is consistent with people's intuitions on reflection, then philosophers feel something has been achieved. Whereas economists often think, okay, that fits with people's intuitions. Why is that so great? And I'm caricaturing, of course. Lawyers are, in a way, in the middle. They draw from economists. We draw from economists and philosophers, but our subject matter is law. And so if we give an account of what the law should be or of what the law actually is when people dispute that fact, we're often pretty satisfied. I did have a great friend, a sociologist, an empirically oriented sociologist at the University of Chicago, who was constantly puzzled by when lawyers were arguing, what were they arguing about? How would we know whether one was right or not? And when I joined the University of Chicago in my 20s, he was probably in his 60s at the time, and he was startled by the conviction with which a lawyer would say this is right and that is wrong. And that question has, I think, productively haunted me for the last years, where I think if lawyers disagree, how do we know who's right? And I think we still don't have a terrific answer to that question.
Before studying law, you did a bachelor in English literature, right? And you are writing a lot of papers and books. But as far as I know, never any nonfiction. Have you ever considered, or are you considering writing a novel or poetry, or maybe you all have already tried your hand at it?
When I was in high school, I wrote a lot of poems about life and romance, because I had life and I didn't have romance. And so the best I could do was poetry. I don't think those were very good poems. In fact, I'm pretty confident that they were very bad poems. I'm not sure if I have them anymore, but the experience of writing bad poetry probably chastened me that I shouldn't try. In terms of fiction, I haven't tried to do that, and I've thought a little bit about it, but I don't think I have the skill. I have ventured a little bit in areas that involve discussion of fiction. So I have a little essay that was actually published on A.S. Byatt's great novel Possession, and that really spoke to a part of the author that some nonfiction by the same author doesn't speak to. And I greatly enjoyed that. In the fullness of time, maybe some fiction, but not tomorrow.
Okay, well, I guess we can look forward to that then. In the context of the book, noise is, as I understood it, the unexplained part of human judgment, and it may vary considerably. I see it as random error, which would be the key difference with bias, which is systematic and can therefore be explained and predicted. Well, I'm an economist, so prediction is important. For viewers that have not read the book, I thought an example may be helpful. If on average, judges punish Black people more severe for the same crime than they do white people, it is bias. And if different judges confronted with the same hypothetical criminal case give sentences varying from 1 to 15 years, it is noise. Is that a correct example, you think?
Completely. And here's one way to think about it that maybe fits with daily experience. So if when you wake up in the morning and you get on your scale, it always shows you as a little heavier than you actually are, that's my scale. It always shows me as slightly heavier than I actually am. That is a biased scale. It's also a mischievous and unkind scale. But what we want to emphasize is the bias of that scale. If you get up in the morning and on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, the scale shows you as a little heavier than you actually are. And if on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, if I have been consistent with the days, it shows you as a little lighter than you actually are, that is a noisy scale. So it might be that your scale is on average correct. It gets your weight right, but half of the time it might be wrong in the sense of too light, and half the time it might be wrong in the sense of too heavy. That's a noisy scale. And the difference between bias and noise is, as you say, exactly systematic error versus random error. That bias, if you're treating, let's say, women worse than men, or people with dark skin less well than people with light skin, or if you're too optimistic and you predict, my dog doesn't like optimism, so he's barking with outrage at the very idea of unrealistic optimism. If people are too optimistic, they will be biased. That idea of bias, it's very charismatic, I think. The human mind goes, aha, and feels it's found the killer in a murder mystery. Noise doesn't have the same kind of charisma. It more raises question marks in the mind, but noise can be the actual killer in an organization or society or government or individual life.
Applying the concept of noise to judges and to crime, I was wondering, in the Netherlands, we have maximum punishments for different crimes, but not minimum punishments. And there's a debate going on whether we should also introduce minimum punishments. Given the evidence on noise, could you reflect on the pros and cons of introducing minimum punishments?
What I'd want to know is whether there's a lot of noise in the Netherlands in the criminal justice system. So if you have no minimum sentences and it turns out that certain people get, let's say, probation or nothing for doing something pretty bad, and other people who are exactly the same get a quite severe punishment, that would be unfair, and it might create mistakes in the sense that at least some of the people are not being treated the way they ought to be. They might be given excessive leniency. So that's a problem, unequal treatment of the similarly situated. We could imagine in the Netherlands, and I've been there several times, and I love the Netherlands. So we could imagine that notwithstanding the absence of a minimum, the kind of unfairness to which I pointed just doesn't happen, that the level of noise in the system turns out to be modest, that if people have done something pretty bad, they're going to be punished pretty badly. And if people have done something that's not so bad, the minimum sentence might be, the sentence they're given might be very lenient, but that wouldn't vary a great deal across similarly situated people. So to answer the question, it might be useful to have what we call a noise audit of criminal sentencing in the Netherlands. And if it turns out there's a great deal of noise in the system, and if one of the forms of the noise is that people who did pretty bad things are being given basically a slap on the wrist or a smile and a nod, then there would be an argument for a minimum sentence. But as Portia said in The Merchant of Venice, the quality of mercy is not strained. And if it's the case that we're seeing a lot of mercy for people who aren't treated severely, that might be okay.
Well, here's a case for doing research, Koen. A noise audit in the judgment system, in the legal system. Okay. For the sake of time, I would like to go to my last series of questions, which is on author bias or author's bias. I guess knowing you and knowing how the knowledge that you as authors must have about gender bias in gender bias, I think you have checked whether the book contains enough female personas, female names, because I don't say I counted the names, but the book starts with the example of friends going to a shooting arcade sharing rifles, which actually, I mean, is the first thing you see in the book. To me, as a female reader, and also being against animal hunting, and this was quite off-putting, I must say. And the book also contains many references to football, baseball, professional athletes, but nothing on fashion or makeup or whatever. And I see that as a world that is predominantly masculine. Did you realize this?
I thank you for that. And this is one reason why second editions are really important. So the example with which we started, we originally didn't use any names, and that was self-conscious, so it wouldn't be male or female names. And I thought of it, and in some versions we were talking about archery, and there's a very famous American actress named Gina Davis who is tried for the Olympics. And when I think of archery, I think of Gina Davis because she's the most prominent. So I think of a woman. I'm not sure whether it was shooting. We went back and forth between archery and shooting, and maybe we landed with shooting, which wouldn't be great. But it wasn't shooting animals; it was shooting to see if you get if you hit the bullseye. And I guess I think of bullseye and archery rather than guns. If the examples all involve male names, that's not good, and we need to have a second edition that fixes it.
No, no problem. The names are okay. The names are balanced. Well, as you are going to publish a second edition, there are several examples that that imply that personas are eating meat or fish, and for that too, you know the importance, the force of the descriptive norm. So maybe you could have a look at that. Let me see, sake of time. You write that 5 months of mandatory maternal leave is absurd. But in Europe, unfortunately not in the Netherlands, we are moving towards a year or 14 months of parental leave because of the evidence that it is so good for newborns to be the first year taken care of by somebody who really loves them, the parents. So, well, I was wondering, where did this come from?
Okay, so the maternal leave mandate from a long time ago, it was maternal leave. So the man at 1 day before the child is born can go into work. The woman, many months before the child is born, can't go into work. So that's sex discriminatory. There's also the feature of the mandate. So if a woman is permitted to take leave, or if a man is permitted to take leave at some point before the child is born, in my view, that's a very good thing. But if they're told they have to, there's a problem. Maybe they need the money. Now, maybe we have a system where they get paid anyhow, in which case that would be solved. But maybe they love the work and they think this is before the child is born. They think that maybe the woman thinks she's a few months pregnant and she thinks I'm feeling great and I don't want to stare at the walls. I want to do my job. And for the government to say, my dog is applauding that sentiment, for the government to say to the mother to be, you have to stay home when there's no health reason, that's sex discriminatory and also arbitrary. By the way, our judges who decided this case were focused on the fact that a rule can be biased, and in this sense, biased on sex discrimination grounds. And that's important, that you can have something that eliminates noise, but is biased.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, just for information also for the readers, in Germany and Scandinavian, parents are fully paid or are paid 3/4 of their salary, both fathers and children and mothers. So, well, hoping to see you on a book tour in Europe as soon as that is possible. And thank you for the interview.
There are now more than 400 nudge units around the world. Units of government or NGOs that are devoted to applying the findings of behavioral science to improve the design of policies aimed at helping people make better decisions. So at the same time, a recent meta-analysis of results by these nudge units only show an average effect of about 8% between the groups that have not been nudged and those that have been nudged. A possible explanation could be that you can only change behavior through nudges to a certain degree. And that other factors than choice architecture could possibly influence behavior even stronger. So is there perhaps, in your view, a gap between the popularity of nudging on the one hand and their effect on the other hand? So that's the first question. Or maybe more positively, could it be that we are only beginning to understand the conditions under which a nudge might be effective? And can we maybe expect even larger effects in the future? Is there more to come, maybe?
Okay, so let me give you a little data from a pretty recent study, which was about take-up of educational technology by parents, where the educational technology leads to much better educational performance by the families that take it up. Under the opt-in design, about 1% of parents use the technology. If the opt-in design is simplified, you get an increase to 8%. If there's automatic enrollment, the participation rate is in excess of 95%. So 1% under standard opt-in, over 95%. I actually think it was well over 95% with opt-out. So that nudge increases by upwards of 90%, the participation rate. A meta-analysis of default rules shows that if you switch from an opt-in to opt-out across a wide range of interventions, you get a 26% increase on average in participation. And in many of those studies, of course, if the average is 26% or the median, you're going to be well higher than that. The nudge units are an extremely small fraction of uses of behavioral science and nudging on the part of governments all over the world. In fact, the most important work that uses behavioral science in terms of impact in the nations I know comes from ministries and departments and not from nudge units. So in some countries, you get a switch from opt-in pension plans to opt-out automatic enrollment that has a very large effect in outcomes. It's well higher than in the typical nudge unit study where you change the wording of a letter and you get an increase by 3 percentage points. In some countries, anti-poverty programs have switched from opt-in to opt-out. And in my country, there's a program that's done that where the participation rate is well over 80%. I think it's over 90%. And it means that 15 million poor children are enjoying free school meals, breakfast and lunch, to which they're legally entitled. So the prize winner in terms of magnitude of impact of nudging is typically switching the default rule. Whether you are going to get a massive change or a modest change from, let's say, a calorie label or a warning depends on the context. If you switch from a nation, let's call it for fun, the Philippines, which doesn't have a GPS device, it does. I'm pleased to say the Philippines, they do have GPS device, but let's call hypothetical Philippines without a GPS device. And then you give all the drivers a GPS device. The magnitude of the welfare gain will be very, very high. And a GPS device is a nudger. So if you can change a letter or if you can simplify a process and increase by 5% the number of people who get something which can make their lives much better, that's good. And if you can do it inexpensively, that's clearly good. So we want to look at costs and benefits, not at magnitude of change. I would take with many grains of salt analyses of nudge units as a full account of the effects of nudges.
Great. Thank you very much for this answer. So in my experience, nudging has become more of what you could call a movement than just the sheer application of changing the choice architecture. So I think this movement also comes with new methodological standards, lots of field experiments, behavior analysis, and also new ways to think about policy making. So it has become less normative and more descriptive. So do you agree with this observation? And how can you explain that all this happens on the basis of just one book, your book?
Well, thank you for that. I think I give credit to an army of people, many of whom were working on this independently or well in advance of Thaler and me. So the idea of doing careful empirical testing, of course, there's in social science, there's a lot of emphasis on that happened decades and in some ways centuries before Nudge. I'd give a great deal of credit to Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize, who's pioneered the use of randomized controlled trials. She is a behavioral economist frequently, but she's first and foremost an empiricist. And she's had a great impact on policymaking throughout the world. Michael Kramer is also in that field. John List is one of my favorite empirical economists, and he's a field experiments guy. He's recently fully come out of the closet as a behavioral economist. So he is self-identified as that. But for years, I think it would have been hard to know how to characterize him except as an empiricist. I think you're quite right that governments all over the world are using empirical methods. Evaluation has become a word with a little halo around it. If Nudge contributed to that, that's an honor, but it's clearly much larger than the book. The only thing I'd add is that while the use of nudging in behavioral science often includes or is focused on field experiments, a lot of the most important work just uses findings that we know are robust and applies them. So if you have a country that has a problem, let's say there's a benefit program where the participation rate is 40%, it's now on the agenda. Why don't we just say people are in the program unless they don't want to be? And that's not necessarily preceded by a field experiment. It's just preceded by a great deal of confidence that it's going to knock the participation rate up. And nations have done that. Lots of nations have done that. Or you might know that there's a great deal of sludge in the form of administrative burdens in the system with respect to, let's say, permits or licenses or access, let's say, to plant-based diets. And it might be that a response is just to make it easier to take the sludge away. And that could be preceded by a randomized controlled trial. But it's a pretty reasonable bet that if you do today the sludge reduction, you're going to have a significant impact. And tomorrow, do the evaluation. Now, if you don't have the data that suggests the intervention is going to work, then it's reckless. But we have so much data about things that are overwhelmingly likely to work that governments are taking advantage of that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. My next question is about System 1 and System 2. So behavioral economics roughly distinguishes two ways of decision making. So with our fast and intuitive System 1, and with our more slow and deliberative System 2. So a part of the narrative around nudging in the early stages after the first book was that nudges would promise access to the until then inaccessible patterns of our unconscious behavior, the System 1. And that it could change unconscious patterns of behavior, these biases that take us away from our path. So even now, I see that people still argue that nudges are these hidden interventions that could influence our decisions outside of our conscious attention. So my first question is, has your view changed on this? And what is your take on this now?
Okay, so I'm trying to think about any nudge that qualifies as covert and hidden. And I'm struggling. So here's a nudge. You go to the restaurant and it tells you the calories associated with food. That might be a good idea. It might not be. It's definitely not hidden. Here's a nudge. You buy an automobile and it tells you about the fuel economy of the car. It might tell you something about the economic benefits or costs of the level of fuel efficiency that car has. or it might tell you something about the environmental impact. That's a nudge. It's anything but hidden. It can't be hidden. You go to the beach and it says that, warning, there are strong currents. If you're not a strong swimmer, maybe don't go into the ocean today. That's a nudge. It's not hidden. It's the opposite of hidden. So warnings, reminders, you get a text message saying you have an appointment for your vaccine day after tomorrow. Is that hidden? That's preposterous. It's actually crazy land, to say. That's the technical term, crazy land, to say that these nudges are hidden. They can't be hidden and work. At a cafeteria I visit a lot, it tells you about the extent of the wait lines at various times. So it'll tell you at certain times there are long waits, at other times there are short waits. That's a nudge to try to get people to allocate their presence so as to smooth out. That couldn't work. Automatic enrollment is typically preceded by extremely clear disclosure that you are being automatically enrolled in. And even if it weren't, it wouldn't be hard to find out, because you'd be in a savings plan or in a healthcare plan. And is that going to be a secret? Is it going to be classified? Is it a national security matter? So I can't think of a single nudge that is covert or hidden. There must be one, but it's a concern which I think is legitimate. We don't want hidden things. I mean, some things we want hidden. On Easter, we want the Easter eggs to be hidden, but we don't want hidden things in government typically. But the concern seems to me a little like saying what? A little like talking about Martians. I mean, there might be Martians, but I haven't seen any.
Okay, that's a very interesting answer. I think at the same time, to me, it's then strange that a lot of the times this is one of the objections that people have when we talk about nudges, that it's secretive and manipulative, and it's strange to me.
Typically, they are proposed to the public in a way that's extremely visible. It's often in the newspaper. It might be a good nudge. It might be a bad nudge. We might switch from opt-in organ donation to opt-out organ donation. I know that was controversial in the Netherlands. It's controversial in some countries. It's very popular in the United Kingdom. It's not hidden. It's the opposite of hidden. So I'm not sure what people are thinking of. They might be thinking of something like subliminal advertising, where if you go to the new James Bond movie and there's in a millisecond it says, "Don't smoke." That would be hidden, but I'm not aware of any government whose anti-smoking strategy has consisted of subliminal advertising, and there would be good reasons to object to subliminal advertising.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so I'm looking at the time, so I'm trying to ask a final question, because you have, I think, like 5 minutes left. Maybe you can choose one. That would be fun. So I have two questions. The one is about sludge. So what is it, and can we expect it to be as big of a term as nudge is? And the other question is, how do you apply behavioral science in the Biden administration? So which one would you like to answer?
I think I'm not allowed to answer the second, so I'll do the first. I'm here as author rather than as bureaucrat. Well, the problem of sludge is something that Dick Thaler and I came to very recently. And what occurred to us is that often good nudges make things easier for people. And often a private institution, or like a bank or a government, can introduce sludge to make things harder for people. And that's, I think, more interesting than it seems. That if people are completely rational and they're being asked to fill out 12 pages of forms, or if it's really hard to get plant-based diets, they might not do it. And the reason is the sludge. And if people to get a visa to go to the Netherlands or to get a permit to build something have to go through a lot of sludge, they might give up. And that is relevant to human beings, not only to perfectly rational actors, because if we are tending to procrastinate, if inertia is pretty important for us, if we're unrealistically optimistic, if we are constrained by time, we don't have infinite time in our days, especially maybe if we're poor or sick or older, or in most societies, female, because women bear the bulk of the administrative burden, typically. It may be that sludge is a source of terrible injustice and inequality, as well as a source of overall welfare losses for societies. And if you can combine terrible injustice with overall adverse effects on economic growth, then you have a dragon that you should slay. And for many societies, sludge is almost like an invisible enemy. And it's invisible for individuals who, when they try to do something and get stymied, say, why is this frustration hitting me in the face? But to have a term, sludge, as a kind of organizing idea for a pervasive problem, that might not be without value.